He who depends on the approval of others to rule holds power only as long as that approval survives. But he who learns to stand by his own authority becomes difficult to overthrow. He who depends on the approval of others to rule holds power only as long as that approval survives. But he who learns to stand by his own authority becomes difficult to overthrow. Inspired by the spirit of Machiavelli. Why do some of the most desired women also seem to be the most emotionally unstable? Why does someone who receives constant admiration still feel a quiet insecurity? And why does the more attention someone receives, the harder it becomes to live without it? Most people believe that beauty brings psychological power, but the reality is less comfortable. Beauty does not build internal structure. It creates external reaction. And when an identity is built primarily from the reactions of others, something inside the person begins to depend on that reaction in order to exist. As Niccolò Machiavelli observed in his reflections on human nature and social power, men judge more by the eye than by the hand, for everyone can see, but few can feel. Everyone sees what you appear to be. Few perceive what you really are. Appearance creates perception, but perception does not create stability, and that is exactly where the problem begins. There is a silent law that governs the social psychology of beauty, and almost no one talks about it. The more a person is validated for their appearance, the greater the chance that their identity begins to form from the reactions of others, rather than from a solid internal structure. This happens slowly, almost invisibly. From a very early age, an extremely attractive woman notices that the environment reacts to her differently. People smile more, strangers help more, small mistakes are easily forgiven, conversations begin more effortlessly. The world seems slightly kinder. At first, it just seems like luck. But psychologically, this type of environment creates a dangerous pattern. The brain begins to learn that personal value comes from external reactions. Looks become confirmation, compliments become reference points, desire becomes validation. Without realizing it, identity begins to lean on this constant social mirror. The problem is that external reactions are unstable by nature. They depend on context, on age, on environment, on the attention of the people around. And when the mind becomes accustomed to using these reactions as its primary source of value, something internal fails to develop with depth. Self-knowledge, inner security, emotional stability, not because the person is weak, but because the environment never demanded these structures. The brain simply adapted to the world it encountered. As Niccolò Machiavelli observed when analyzing how human beings judge one another, men, in general, judge more by the eyes than by the hands, because seeing belongs to everyone, but feeling belongs to few. Everyone sees what you appear to be, but few perceive what you truly are. Appearance shapes people's perception, and when a person spends years being defined by that perception, something curious happens. She begins to believe that perception is who she is. But perceptions change, and when they change, the identity built upon them begins to tremble. This is the point where many insecurities appear, not because the person has lost value, but because her identity was never built away from the eyes of others. There is another psychological law that few people notice. The human brain quickly adapts to the level of stimulation it frequently receives. And when someone grows up receiving constant attention, the nervous system begins to consider that level of attention as the normal state of reality. This happens because the brain operates through chemical rewards. Every time someone receives social approval, a compliment, a look of interest, a positive comment, the brain releases dopamine. This neurotransmitter is linked to the systems of reward, motivation, and learning. In simple terms, dopamine teaches the brain what should be repeated. If a behavior generates a reward, the brain records it as something important for social survival. Now imagine this process happening repeatedly over many years. Glances on the street, people trying to please, constant messages, frequent invitations, immediate interest in almost any environment. Each of these situations reinforces the same neurological circuit. Over time, the brain adjusts to this elevated pattern of social stimulation. This creates a silent psychological phenomenon. Excess becomes normal. When this happens, ordinary levels of attention begin to feel insufficient. Stable relationships may start to seem monotonous. Quiet environments may start to feel empty. Moments without validation may generate discomfort. Not because something is actually wrong, but because the nervous system was trained in an environment of constant stimulation. The brain does not like to lose what it has learned to consider necessary, and when the level of social validation decreases, something that inevitably happens over the course of life, the nervous system may interpret this change as a loss. This feeling of loss activates mechanisms of anxiety, insecurity, and social hyperinterpretation. Small changes begin to seem like major signals. Silence becomes doubt. A short response becomes rejection. A day without attention becomes a threat. On the surface, it appears to be emotional instability. But beneath it, something simpler is happening. The brain is merely reacting to the removal of a stimulus to which it was conditioned for a long time. And when attention becomes the primary source of psychological reward, living without it can feel far more difficult than it should. There is a psychological consequence that is rarely discussed when people talk about beauty. Easy environments often produce fragile internal structures. The human mind develops emotional strength mainly through frustration, rejection, limits, and social difficulties. These moments force the individual to build internal resources, self-control, emotional independence, and tolerance for discomfort. But when someone grows up being constantly well received, many of these experiences occur with less intensity. The person is not rejected as often. They are not ignored as easily. They do not need to prove their value in the same way other people do. This does not mean their life is perfect. It simply means that some of the challenges that shape the psychological structure of many people appear in a softer form. And without those challenges, certain internal abilities may take longer to develop. Emotional resilience is born from friction with reality. It emerges when someone has to deal with the feeling of not being chosen, when they must face rejection without explanation, when they realize they cannot control how other people perceive them. These experiences force the construction of an identity that is more independent from external opinion. But when the social environment offers constant validation, this necessity decreases. The person often learns, without realizing it, that their presence alone is enough to generate acceptance. And this creates a different psychological structure, not necessarily worse, but often less prepared for moments when validation disappears. Because at some point in life, the dynamic changes, attention decreases, the environment changes, new people appear, youth is no longer the center of social perception, and when that happens, something curious emerges. People who spend their lives being constantly chosen may have more difficulty dealing with the experience of no longer being the center of social reactions. Not because they are fragile by nature, but because the human mind adapts deeply to the environment in which it was formed. And when that environment changes, the brain must relearn how to exist without the stimuli it once depended on. This process can be silent, confusing, and emotionally destabilizing, not due to a lack of intelligence, but due to a lack of psychological training for this type of reality. And often, that training was simply never necessary before. There's a very common confusion in human perception. People tend to associate beauty with psychological power. When someone is highly desired, they automatically appear confident, dominant, and emotionally strong. But this association is more of a perceptual illusion than a psychological reality. Beauty generates immediate social power. It opens doors. It facilitates interactions. It attracts attention. But that does not mean it builds emotional structure. In fact, emotional structure almost always develops through opposite experiences: frustration, rejection, difficulty, and clear limits. These experiences force the mind to develop internal resources: self-sufficiency, resilience, emotional control. When someone spends much of their life protected from these social pressures, part of that development may simply not occur with the same intensity. This creates a curious contradiction. Externally, the person appears powerful. Internally, their stability still depends on the environment continuing to react the same way it always has. And the problem is that the world changes. Attention changes. People's interests change. Novelty disappears. When that happens, many people face for the first time a question they never needed to answer before. Who am I? When no one is reacting to me. That is the moment when true psychological structure appears. Because appearance can influence how people perceive you. But emotional stability has never been built by the gaze of others. Closing. There is something uncomfortable about this conversation, because it breaks an illusion many people prefer to maintain. The idea that beauty, admiration, and desire are signs of psychological strength. But in reality, they are often just signs of social reaction. And social reaction has never been a stable foundation for identity. The problem is not beauty. The problem is when an entire life is built around what others see, and not around who a person truly is when no one is watching. Because attention always changes. It decreases. It shifts. It finds new focal points. And when that happens, only one question remains that can no longer be avoided. Who are you when no one is reacting to you? That question rarely appears while validation is constant, but it always arrives, sooner or later. And when it does, it doesn't matter how much someone was admired in the past. What matters is whether there is any internal structure that does not depend on it. If you made it this far, I truly appreciate it. Not because understanding these dynamics makes life more comfortable. In fact, it usually does the opposite. The more you realize how psychological games work, the harder it becomes to pretend they do not exist. But at least one thing changes. You begin to see people beyond the surface. And that, although it does not make the world lighter, makes it far more real. If this kind of reflection made you a little uncomfortable, it may be because it touched something that usually goes unnoticed. In that case, you already know what to do. Subscribe to the channel. Here, we are not interested in beautiful versions of human psychology. We are interested in the version that truly operates behind appearances. If you've made it to this point in the video, it deserves a more honest thank you than the quick acknowledgements that usually appear at the end of online content. Because the truth is, this kind of conversation isn't comfortable. Most people prefer content that reassures them, that offers simple answers, or that paints human behavior as more noble than it usually is. It's easier to believe that people always act with awareness, that attraction reveals character, or that appearance reflects depth. But those who observe reality more carefully begin to notice something different. They realize that many relationships are guided by validation, that many decisions are driven by the need for recognition, and that many identities are built more from the gaze of others than from something solid within the person themselves. When you start to see these patterns, something changes. You begin to notice dynamics that once seemed invisible. Small status competitions, emotional dependencies disguised as romance, people trying to sustain images that were created to please those watching from the outside. And once you see these mechanisms, it becomes difficult to return to a more naive view of human behavior. That doesn't mean the world becomes worse, but it becomes clearer, more direct, less masked. So if you stayed until this point, thank you for being willing to observe these layers of human psychology without needing them to be softened or turned into comfortable stories. Because understanding how people really function doesn't make life lighter, but makes the way you see the world far more honest.